I've been into urban exploration for several years now. Something about venturing into forbidden places that hold remnants of the past really excites me. It's honest fun. I like to think it's better than vandalizing these condemned places or leaving beer cans scattered everywhere. All I bring with me is my Nikon. I take photos and occasionally post them on my Tumblr page. It's about nostalgia for me. There's something haunting, strangely beautiful about the places I grew up with and what they've become. That's why the mall was my favorite place to explore. It's a strange hobby. You don't find a lot of like-minded people doing it. My girlfriend Julie would come along on my outings. She liked the adventure, the thrill of doing something you're not supposed to. But she wouldn't come with me into the pit. We'd been back to the mall a handful of times by then. Each visit revealed something new. In a place that vast, there's always something left behind. When we explored the east side of the building for the first time, I stumbled upon something strange. The floor had caved in. It was right at the base of the escalator, a dark hole in the tile. A steady dripping sound echoed from inside. I took a photo. The flash from the Nikon lit the edges of the break in the floor. Julie stood beside me, unsettled. The collapse looked wrong, not jagged or chaotic like you'd expect. At first I thought it was a trick of light, but it looked like the escalator stairs continued downward, into the hole, into the darkness. I pulled my phone's flashlight and stepped closer. Julie was anxious. It was dangerous, stupid honestly. I told her I just wanted a better look. That's when I saw it. The gleam of ribbed metal steps. It was the escalator, descending below the mall. A subterranean escalator. I took a few more photos, and we left. The next evening I was working late, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was at the bottom of the pit? It defied logic. A floor partitioned between two sets of stairs, one leading down into something that shouldn't have existed. It felt like something out of a dream. I decided that night I would go back. I knew Julie wouldn't like it, so I didn't tell her. My camera bag was already in the car, so I drove straight to the mall after work. It was raining hard when I got there, my old windshield wipers groaning as they dragged across the glass. The abandoned structure came into view, massive and obsolete, a relic of a time long past. When I went inside, it was empty. It usually was, aside from winos and graffiti artists, or the rare sighting of another urban explorer. But this felt entirely empty. You could tell from the silence alone, broken only by the patter of rainwater. It slipped through a shattered skylight and tapped steadily against the linoleum floor. I approached the area where the hole was, where the underground stairway waited. It was exactly where I'd seen it the day before. I set my pack down and prodded the edge with my boot, testing the surrounding tile to see if it might give way. The rupture seemed isolated to that single section where the escalator descended. I stood there for a long while, staring into it, but I knew I had to go down. I had to see what was below. This would be my greatest discovery to date. Even if it was nothing more than a vast empty room, it was beneath the mall, something hidden and only exposed by years of neglect. I crab-walked over the lip of the escalator and began descending slowly into the abyssal dark. My phone's flashlight wasn't very powerful, so I couldn't see the bottom for some time. The steps carried on much farther than the escalator above ever had. The space around me felt enormous. I didn't see any support beams. Architecturally, it made no sense. It was as if the mall above was floating over a cavern. Then I started to feel something. The faintest sense of motion. It started subtle, then grew into something gradual and familiar, like the slow hum of machinery coming alive, as if the escalator were bringing me down. I stopped. Visually, nothing had changed. The steps beneath my feet were still. The darkness still pressed in around me. But I felt it. The sensation of descent. There was a bottom, maybe 70 or 80 feet below the break in the floor. When my light finally reached it, I saw checkered tile, colorful, dated, unmistakably from the 1990s. For a moment, I half expected to see storefronts and faceless shoppers drifting by. Instead, there were metallic doors lining a hallway. The layout mirrored the mall above, but stripped of style and color. It was industrial, characterless, a hollow version of what sat overhead. I approached the first door and pulled it open slowly, metal groaning in protest. The smell hit me immediately. It was rot and mildew, something sweet and sour all at once. I stepped back, pulling my shirt over my nose before angling the flashlight inside. The room was enormous, larger than I'd expected. Mountains of clothing were piled high. T-shirts, jeans, dresses, and shoes. The heaps rose so tall that my beam couldn't find their ceiling. Everything was damp and mold-ridden. Many pieces had decayed beyond recognition. Some tags were still visible. Abercrombie and American Eagle, brands so closely tied to the mall above. Was this an abandoned stockroom? Some overflow storage forgotten over time? It looked more like a landfill. When I stepped back into the hallway, something stopped me cold. A mannequin stood in the center. I hadn't noticed it before. Its face was grotesque, partially melted. Features warped as though exposed to heat. It wore rotting clothes, once stylish, now hanging in tatters much like the piles in the room I'd just left. I raised my flashlight. Further down the hall, silhouettes stood in the darkness. More mannequins. Different poses, different styles. Some leaned slightly. Some faced blank walls where display windows would have been in the mirrored mall above. They stood scattered throughout the corridor like an abandoned art installation. I lifted my camera and snapped photos. The flash burst white in the dark. The mannequins didn't move. They didn't react. I walked past them, weaving around them as though navigating an occupied mall. My heart was hammering now. It wasn't just surreal. It was wrong. The mildew-heavy air clung to my lungs, and for the first time, I wondered what I was actually breathing down here. I could only imagine what lay behind the other doors. More rooms of discarded, forgotten things. The hallway stretched on endlessly. Mannequins posed like people waiting for something that would never come. I decided to turn back. I would return. I already knew that. This was a treasure, something I wanted to share. Maybe I could even convince Julie to come next time. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something strange. The mannequins hadn't changed position, not directly, at least not in any way I could point to. But in the corners of my vision, subtleties began to tickle my brain in the worst way. An arm slightly higher than before, a head angled just a little more toward me. I knew it was my mind playing tricks. It had to be. But by all accounts, this place shouldn't even physically exist. My sense of reality began to feel thin. I picked up the pace, moving faster toward the escalator. Had I really come this far? The walk back felt much longer. The thought alone made me quicken my stride. The subtleties grew more frequent. There were more mannequins now, or at least it felt that way. The hallway no longer looked sparse and abandoned. It felt crowded, like prime time for shopping. My pulse thudded in my ears. Panic crept in. Where was the escalator? Sounds began filtering in, faint at first. Whispers, the soft shuffle of footsteps. Was that music? Distant and tinny, like mall speakers bleeding through static. I turned abruptly, scanning the corridor behind me, half expecting a mannequin to be sprinting toward me. They stood where they'd been. Still, I stepped backward and bumped into something. A dull tunk echoed off the walls. I'd knocked over one of them. Its head and arm had separated from the body, rolling a short distance across the tile. The sight of it filled me with a strange, immediate guilt, like I'd committed some unspeakable act. I turned again. The mannequins, they were all looking at me. I felt a prickling heat rise in my cheeks. Then I ran. I think I even shut my eyes at one point, like a child afraid of what might be standing in front of him. When I opened them, the escalator was there, right in front of me. I nearly run right into it. When I turned back, at the edge of the darkness, I could see faint silhouettes. They were all facing my direction. I ran up the escalator 2 steps at a time, stumbling more than once as my legs turned to rubber. I climbed and climbed until my hands reached the lip of the hole, and I pulled myself back into the mall above. I was still here. It was all still here. And I think that is what scared me the most. When we moved into our new home, something about the neighborhood felt strange to me. By all accounts, it was just an ordinary place. A quiet street with trimmed lawns and 2-car garages. The sort of suburb you see 1,000 times driving through the outskirts of a city. But there were subtleties I couldn't shake. I was a kid back then, and kids have time to notice things adults don't. The small details, the things that don't quite fit. For a long time, I couldn't put words to it. Then eventually, it clicked. Everything was too perfect. Maybe perfect isn't the right word. It was organized, uniform. Every house looked like a copy of the one beside it. The lawns were cut so evenly, it looked like a green carpet had been rolled across the whole neighborhood. The sidewalks were spotless. It felt wrong in the way a dream feels wrong. Nothing out of place. Yet somehow everything was. I didn't learn the term until years later, but it fits perfectly now. A liminal space. What made it stranger wasn't just the neighborhood itself, it was the people. They looked like something out of a catalog. The fathers wore suits, the mothers wore sundresses, the kids had their hair combed neatly to one side. Sure, the outfits changed from day to day, but the sameness was uncanny. Like variations of the same template. When we pulled into the driveway, I remember staring at our house. Just another house. Identical to all the others. My mom was thrilled. Some of her excitement rubbed off on my sister, who was already talking about which room she wanted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was just wrong. That first afternoon, my sister and I went outside to play. Most of our things were still buried in moving boxes, but we managed to dig out a soccer ball. We kicked it back and forth in the front yard while the sun hung low over the roofs. The street was quiet. That's when I noticed 2 kids standing across the road. They weren't playing or talking. They were just standing there. One of them was staring at the ground. At first I thought maybe he'd spotted a bug or something interesting in the grass. We wandered over and introduced ourselves the awkward way kids do. Up close, I realized the boy wasn't looking at anything. He had simply been staring at the ground, like he had been paused. Only when I spoke did he move. His head lifted slowly and he looked at me. "My name's Tommy," he said. Then nothing. He just stared. His eyes didn't look focused. They weren't unfriendly or curious. They were just empty. I tried making conversation. I asked how long he'd lived here, what kids do for fun around the neighborhood, whether there were parks nearby. Each answer came after a pause. A long one, like his brain had to wait for permission before speaking. The other child never said a word. She stood at the tree in the yard, staring up into the branches as if something fascinating was happening there. But the tree wasn't moving. Nothing was. That night I explored our new home. It was pristine in the way new homes often are, though this one technically wasn't new. I remember hearing my dad mention that earlier while he was carrying boxes in from the truck. Another family had lived here before us, maybe even more than one. But walking through the house, you never would have known it. The floors weren't just clean, they appeared untouched. The hardwood ran through the living room and down the hallways without a single scratch or dull spot, even in places where you'd expect wear: doorways, corners, the edge of the kitchen counter. There was nothing. No scuffs and no dents. No little imperfections that come from years of people living in a place. Even the walls were strange. If you ever look closely at drywall, you'll notice little things. Slight bumps where someone spackled over a nail hole. Subtle texture differences where paint had been touched up. Houses accumulate those things over time, the way people collect freckles. But here, the walls were perfectly smooth. Not freshly painted smooth, just smooth. Like they had been printed rather than built. I wandered through each room slowly. The living room, then the dining room, then the kitchen where the cabinets all lined up in perfect symmetry. Every drawer slid open effortlessly. Every door closed without a sound. Even the hinges seemed too quiet. The whole place felt immaculate, and that's what bothered me the most. My parents were downstairs unpacking dishes. My sister had claimed her bedroom and was already deciding where posters would go. I walked into my room and looked out the window. That's when I noticed the neighbors. Across the street, they were walking their dog along the sidewalk. A golden retriever with a shiny coat. The family looked exactly like the others in the neighborhood. The father in a pressed shirt and slacks. The mother in a light dress. The kid walking just slightly behind them. But for half a second before I looked, something was wrong. The father had one foot lifted slightly off the pavement, like he was mid-step. The kid's arm was swinging forward, but none of them were moving. Like I said, this was only for half a second. They were perfectly still, frozen in place, and then they were moving again. It wasn't abrupt or like someone startled out of a trance. It was as if they just resumed. The father's foot lowered onto the sidewalk. The dog kept moving. It was so quick, at first I thought I had imagined it, but I knew what I saw. And as the family walked past the edge of the streetlight and disappeared into the darker part of the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that they hadn't started moving again until I looked at them. That they had been frozen there, waiting for a cue, like a videotape someone had paused, waiting for someone to press play. My parents didn't seem to notice when the neighbors began coming over with desserts and casseroles, as if there had been a death in the family rather than new neighbors moving in. Our refrigerator quickly began to overflow with bland, pale food. There were casseroles with barely any seasoning, cakes that looked homemade but carried almost no smell, and loaves of bread that appeared warm and fresh but tasted strangely empty. One by one, the neighbors rang the doorbell and welcomed us to the neighborhood. Each of them used almost the exact same phrasing, delivered in the same polite, monotone cadence, accompanied by the same practiced smile. It was uncanny to watch. They stood there waiting patiently while my mother thanked them. Then they would turn and walk back down the driveway toward their identical homes. My parents never seemed to think anything about it. To them, it was simply what friendly neighbors did. But the more I watched these people, the less convinced I became that any of them truly existed in the way normal people do. I could almost picture what happened after they returned home. The image formed so clearly in my mind that it began to feel less like imagination and more like an explanation. They would walk inside, close their front doors, and then simply stand there in their living rooms in a straight line, perfectly still, waiting for their cue. Waiting for the moment when someone from our family rang their doorbell, drove past their house, or glanced out a window in their direction. Only then would they begin again, resuming the slow simulation of sentience they had been performing since the day we arrived. I realize how strange that sounds, the kind of self-centered thinking only a kid could come up with, the childish belief that the whole world revolves around you. But each one of my neighbors gave me the same feeling every time I saw them. It was like the lights were on. but nobody was home. All of this finally came to a head about a week after we moved into the neighborhood. That afternoon, I was carrying a couple paint cans from the garage to the front of the house. People were out and about along the street. One of the neighbors stood near his rose garden, watering the bushes with a slow, steady stream from a green hose. Another man was leisurely jogging along the sidewalk. A sedan drifted past the house so slowly that at first it barely seemed to be moving at all. At first glance, it looked like a normal suburban afternoon, the sort of quiet neighborhood scene you might see in a commercial for lawn fertilizer or real estate. That is, it looked normal if you didn't study it too closely and ignored the smaller details. My sister had left several of her dolls scattered near the walkway earlier that morning. I didn't see one of them lying half across the path until my foot caught it. I stumbled forward and one of the paint cans slipped from my hands. It struck the concrete with a hollow metallic sound and burst open. Thick white paint splashed across the walkway, spraying the shrubs, speckling the grass, and scattering droplets across the driveway in a messy constellation. For a moment, the only thought in my head was how angry my father was going to be. I tried to figure out what I could do in that exact moment to fix it, or at least make it less noticeable. Then, I looked up. Everyone had stopped moving. The car sat motionless in the street with the engine idling. The jogger stood frozen, one foot hovering slightly above the pavement. The man watering the roses still held the hose, and water continued to pour onto the plants, but his body no longer moved. Every single one of them was staring at me. It was the kind of glance you get when someone notices a small accident. They stared with a strange intensity, as if I had committed a crime so severe that words alone couldn't express their disapproval. I waited for someone to say something, for someone to laugh, or for at least one person to break the silence. No one did. They simply continued to look at me. In that moment, I felt like an intruder who had broken some unspoken rule. I was the outsider that had stained this carefully arranged community. I could feel hot tears beginning to gather in my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of them. I refused to cry in front of those things. Instead, I turned and ran for the house, leaving a trail of white paint across the concrete and onto the floor inside. I found my dad in the kitchen and wrapped my arms around him, apologizing over and over while trying to explain what had happened. When I pulled away, I noticed the trail of paint behind me stretching across the floor. My shoes had tracked it all over the entryway. It was even worse than I had thought. I braced myself for him to start yelling, but he didn't. When I looked up at him, he wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was just staring at me, the same way the neighbors had. It was 1996 when I started my office job, working in a cubicle. The world hasn't really changed since then, only the aesthetics. These days they dress it up with softer lighting, bright colors, and Swedish furniture. Back then, there was no attempt to hide it. The building was brutalist. Outside was a concrete labyrinth without a single window. Inside were rows and rows of cubicles, stretching across the floor like a grid. The only sounds were fluorescent lights humming overhead and the occasional landline ringing somewhere in the distance. Everything smelled faintly of burnt dust and copier toner. The whole thing was a nightmare. Every day I'd wake up, drive in traffic to that place, sit down at my desk, and begin working. But here's the strange part. I don't know what I was working on. And I mean that in the most literal sense. I'd spent 6 years at that company. I won't disclose the name for reasons, but the entire time I was there, I sat staring at a screen. A spreadsheet would be open, and I'd type numbers into the tiny little boxes. At the end of the day, I'd submit my data, and I had no idea what any of the numbers meant. They came from somewhere. A file would appear in the system every morning. Column of figures, sometimes thousands of them. My job was to move them into another spreadsheet after applying a few formulas the company had given me during training. Nobody ever explained what the formulas did. You didn't ask questions in that place, not because it was forbidden exactly. It just wasn't the sort of environment where people cared to know. Everyone around me seemed to be doing the same thing, quietly staring at their monitors, typing numbers into identical grids. I would press submit, the file would disappear, and the next morning, another one would be waiting. I never learned the name of a single coworker, and I don't think they learned mine either. I had no idea who my boss was. I didn't receive quarterly reviews. I was like everyone else, isolated to a cubicle. In all the years I was there, nobody spoke, not in the break room, or by the water cooler, not even passing each other in the hall. It was as if we were all machines, sitting at desks. I hate to say it, but while I worked in that place, I think the person I was, the person I am, started to dissolve into the noise of it. Day after day of staring at that screen, typing numbers into those tiny little boxes. The longer I stayed, the more certain I became that I was slowly turning into another piece of the system, just another cog. People talk about office jobs like that all the time. The commute, the cubicles, the feeling of being just another number in a company that doesn't know you exist. That place crossed into something else entirely, something uncanny. Most of the time, being in that office felt like living inside a fog. Not literally, of course. I could see the screen. I could hear the lights humming overhead. I could feel the keyboard beneath my fingers. But mentally, it was like drifting somewhere just behind myself. Days blurred together. Weeks disappeared. Entire months passed without leaving much of an impression. I'd arrive, sit down, type numbers into those little boxes, and eventually it would be evening. Then I'd go home. It was like sleepwalking through 6 years of my life. Until one day, something changed. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the spreadsheet like always, when I felt my heart start beating faster. At first, I thought I was having some kind of medical episode. My chest tightened. My hands started trembling over the keyboard. Then I realized what it actually was. I was aware. Truly aware. For the first time in a long time, it felt like my mind had pushed its way back to the surface. Like I had been underwater and suddenly broken through for air. And the moment that happened, I knew something was wrong. I was looking at the spreadsheet on my screen, thousands of numbers arranged in neat little rows. I had typed them for years, but that day, I realized I had no idea what they meant. My hands were still shaking when I reached for a scrap of paper in my desk drawer. I copied a handful of the numbers down as quickly as I could and folded the paper small enough to fit in my pocket. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some part of me knew that once I walked out of that building, whatever clarity I found might disappear again. It wasn't until the weekend, when I finally had a moment to myself, that I remembered the piece of paper in my pocket. I unfolded the paper at my kitchen table. It was late Saturday morning. Sunlight was coming through the blinds in thin white stripes. The kind of quiet morning where everything feels normal again. For the first time all week, my head felt clear. I looked down at the numbers I had written. They still didn't look like anything special. Just a few strings of digits I'd copied down in a hurry. Some long, some short, one with a decimal. I turned on my computer and started searching them, one by one. The first one returned a weather report, a temperature reading from a small monitoring station somewhere in Nevada. That didn't seem strange at first. The company could have been processing environmental data, government contracts, that sort of thing. The second number matched a water level reading from a reservoir in Oregon. The third appeared in a geological database, a seismic measurement from somewhere in the Pacific. It was all from different sources and different agencies. It didn't seem like any of them connected. Still, it felt strange enough that I kept going. I started searching more numbers from the paper, Another one returned a temperature reading, but this time it wasn't from a weather station. It was from a medical report, a hospital database. The temperature had been recorded during an emergency room intake. I remember pausing there, not because it was alarming, just because it didn't seem to fit with the others. I searched the next number. That one matched a timestamp from a fire department report. A house fire somewhere in Kansas. 2 people had died. I sat there for a moment after that, because for the first time since I started looking into the numbers, a thought occurred to me that I didn't like very much. I checked another one, and another. The more numbers I searched, the stranger the list became. They weren't from one system, they were from dozens. It was all different places and different events, but every single one had something in common. Each number had been recorded at the exact same moment. Someone died. I sat there for a long time thinking about what all of this meant. The data itself wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was coordinates, sometimes a timestamp, sometimes something as simple as an area code. But every event had one thing in common. The deaths had all occurred within the last 24 hours. The same 24 hours in which I had typed those numbers into the spreadsheet. It couldn't be a coincidence. I needed more information. So I made a plan to go back to the office on Monday and pull a little more data. But even as I made the plan, I felt a strange doubt creeping in. I had a suspicion that when Monday arrived, I wouldn't feel this urgency anymore. That I would walk into that building and the fog would settle over me again, the same way it had every day for 6 years. I would sit down at my desk, open the spreadsheet, and fall back into the old routine without questioning any of it. The thought frightened me more than the numbers had, so I tried to hold on to the feeling I had in that moment, tried to fix it in my mind, like a photograph, the feeling of being awake. Monday came. Like most memories from that place, the details are hazy now, but this day remains clearer than the others, perhaps because I had entered the building already half expecting something to be wrong. The office looked exactly the same, business as usual. I walked to my desk and sat down, and immediately saw that my spreadsheet was empty. Where there should have been rows of raw data waiting for me, there was nothing at all. Not a single number. Just a blank grid of cells stretching across the screen. For a moment, my heartbeat quickened again, just as it had the previous week. I found myself waiting for something to happen, for someone to approach my desk, for a supervisor to appear and inform me, calmly and professionally, that they knew what I had done. I even stood up from my chair and looked down the aisles between the cubicles, half expecting to see someone walking to me from a distance. But no one was. The office remained exactly as it always had. Quiet, ordered, and mechanical. Just rows of silent people, staring at silent screens. So I sat back down, and I stared at the empty spreadsheet for the rest of the day. It was the longest workday I had experienced in that building. The next day was the same. And the day after that. Nearly a full week passed, with nothing appearing on my screen at all. Each morning I arrived, sat down, and stared at the empty grid for 8 hours before going home. At first I felt anxious, then confused. Eventually, something stranger happened. I began to feel as though I was being watched. Not by a person exactly. Nothing so simple as that. More like the system itself was waiting to see what I would do. Then one morning, a number appeared. Just one. It sat there alone in the spreadsheet. I stared at it for a long time, before finally applying the formula I had been taught years before. At the end of the workday, I pressed submit, just as I always had. The next morning, there were more numbers waiting for me. Only a handful. It felt less like receiving new work, and more like being cautiously reintroduced to something I had briefly stepped away from. As if the system were testing me, making sure I was still willing to do what it required. And this time, I wouldn't fail it again. I didn't want to see my number on their next. I don't think the neighborhood I grew up in was real. I know how that sounds. It sounds like I should be institutionalized. But listen to my story, my whole story, and you can decide for yourself. Because the more I think about it now, the less sense any of it makes. I remember that Shel Silverstein book, Where the Sidewalk Ends. I don't think I ever read any of the poems inside. What drew me in was the cover itself, a sidewalk that simply stopped, dropping off a cliff. We lived in a large subdivision. You know the type. Houses of varying colors, with identical proportions, neatly partitioned lots, immaculate green grass that had a vibrance only chemicals could achieve. It was the painting of the American dream. We were middle class, but middle class meant more in the 90s than it does today. I had two best friends who lived in the houses on either side of mine, Jan and Bobby. We were still in elementary school when we started our adventures. I hadn't realized Jan would become the girl next door. We'd end up high school sweethearts years later. Bobby never made it very far. He died in Afghanistan at 19. But back when we were kids, dumb kids who believed the world belonged to us, we sword fought with sticks, built crooked forts in the woods, climbed trees until someone eventually fell and broke a bone. And one summer, at the Scholastic Book Fair, the three of us found that Shel Silverstein book. We stared at the cover. Where does the sidewalk end? It felt like the kind of mystery kids were supposed to solve. If only we knew how dark things would turn out. The school year had just ended, and summer had begun in full. Every day felt endless. Every morning we met at the cul-de-sac just after sunrise. Jan brought one of those black and white composition notebooks and a pen with 3 colored tips, a marvel from the book fair. Our plan felt foolproof. We would be cartographers this summer, map the neighborhood street by street, corner by corner. Our mission: we would find out definitively where the sidewalk ends. Our subdivision was massive. We had explored maybe a square mile of it, every cul-de-sac, every wooded lot. But beyond that was mystery. The houses simply kept going. So we packed our nearly empty school bags and set out like explorers. We found walking sticks. We joked about being knights. To us, it felt like we were the Fellowship, marching toward Mordor. What was strange was as we started venturing outside the recognizable neighborhood, things began to feel quieter. It was Saturday morning, yet the driveways were empty. The houses began losing their personality. Fewer wind chimes, garden gnomes, fewer toys left in the yard. The little details that make a house feel lived in began disappearing, like displays rather than places where people actually lived. The lawns were perfectly cut, the hedges trimmed evenly. Even the sidewalk looked different. It was smooth, almost polished, as if no one had walked on it before. There were no realtor signs, nothing to suggest the houses were for sale. They just seemed vacant. Bobby decided his walking stick was now a machine gun. He was rolling around the grass, taking firing stances and whispering that Jerry was all around us and we had to stay alert. I remember wondering who Jerry was. I glanced over at Jan's map, not expecting much, but was honestly blown away by how carefully she'd been documenting everything. Street names neatly labeled, little sketches of landmarks, handwriting so clean it made me embarrassed to think of my own. We kept walking. Noon was approaching, though we wouldn't notice how sore our feet were until much later. We were cresting a fairly large hill. Bobby was complaining about how fun it would be to ride down it if only he had his bike. I still remember the look on their faces when we reached the top. From there, we could see a vast expanse of neighborhood below, and it was all just more of the same. Rows of houses stretching in every direction. We couldn't see an end to it. From that height, the whole subdivision looked like something growing in a petri dish, the streets spreading outward like veins. Still, the sidewalk continued. Before, we could see that something was off. Now it was more of a feeling, something you couldn't quite explain. Everything was there, but something about it felt incomplete. If you glanced at a house quickly, it looked normal enough, but if you stared for more than a moment, the details didn't seem right. The wood siding looked too smooth, like the grooves had been sanded away. The windows reflected nothing. Even the grass didn't quite move in the wind the way grass should. It looked more like turf, artificial. Something unspoken passed between us in that moment. We were alone. We knew nobody was home. And we knew we could look into windows and slip into backyards without anyone calling out angrily. There would be no dogs barking, no voices telling us to leave. We knew this place simply wasn't real. Bobby went first. He squeezed between a pair of hedges and peered into a set of windows. Jan and I followed slowly, crouching beside him and whispering, asking what he saw. I half expected the inside to be empty, just a hollow shell, but the houses were furnished. Only the furnishings were wrong. A plain living room set, a box television, a clock on the wall. Everything you would expect to see inside a suburban home. But the television was off. The furniture looked untouched. The clock wasn't ticking, and everything lacked the small details that make a place feel alive. The room looked less like a home, and more like someone's crude interpretation of one. We moved to another house and looked inside again. That's when the dread really began to settle in. Each house we checked, each living room and backyard, they were all exactly the same. The colors of the houses changed, but the interiors never did. That was the moment I realized we had stumbled upon something we weren't meant to find. It was also the moment I felt certain we were getting closer than we ever had before to finding out where the sidewalk ends. Jan and Bobby were trailing behind me as we continued up the street. We had agreed that we should turn around at 3 p.m. We would have to retrace our steps quickly to get home before dinner time. We were approaching that point, so I was picking up the pace. I knew we were getting closer to the end. I could feel it, as each house began losing more and more detail. The colors were gone now. Each house was white, the lawn green, and the interior stripped down to the barest details. There was no paint and no rug. Each house progressively minimized. We had reached the point where we looked in a window, and all that could be seen was a single white couch, absent of any texture. Jan was getting anxious. I was too, but it was like watching a movie. I had to see the ending. I think all of this would have been more uncanny if we were older, if we had realized this isn't how homes are constructed. They don't slowly develop features, details, furniture, and occupants. In our young minds, I'm not sure we ever questioned it. There was just something in the back of our heads telling us this place was strange. The neighborhood continued, if you could even call it a neighborhood anymore. Each lot was partitioned, like the ones before it, but the missing features could no longer be ignored. One house simply didn't have windows. Another had half a door. Each one was white, flat, and without defining features, and each one had something missing. The road had become a flat gray strip. The sidewalk continued, but the cracks were gone. Bobby and Jan called out to me. I was so engrossed by all of this that I hadn't paid attention to how far ahead I'd walked. They were further back now, standing at the start of the strange unfinished street. They called to me again, saying it was time to turn back. I could hear the fear in their voices. I I told them I just needed one more minute and pushed forward. They protested, but I didn't listen. I kept walking. The houses were half houses now, like a home sliced clean down the center. Eventually, there were no longer houses at all, just perfect squares of grass. Grass without texture, perfect partitions of featureless green. I watched as the sidewalk went on around the bend, on and on until it didn't. This was it. I'd found it. I'd found where the sidewalk ended. But unlike Shel Silverstein's book, it didn't fall off a cliff. It wasn't comedic or cinematic even. In front of me was simply a forest of trees, but they stood in stark contrast to the surrounding neighborhood. The forest was real. The texture of bark and leaves, brush and ferns. I looked back. The neighborhood looked wrong beyond what I could comprehend in that moment. It's one of those things where you grow used to something unnatural. After a while, it begins to feel ordinary. But seeing reality and the neighborhood side by side, I knew. This neighborhood was an anomaly. It was wrong. I looked down at my feet where I stood on the sidewalk, the unfinished texture, the flat terrain. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the eye, but as I kept watching, I knew it was true. The sidewalk was growing outward, slowly extending toward the forest ahead. It wasn't the end. If anything, it may have only been the beginning. We had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight when the car started to make a strange hissing sound. That was new. It was an '87 Pinto, only 5 years old, but we could tell already it was a complete lemon. I knew it didn't really have the legs for a drive like this, but we didn't have much of a choice. Trish and I had crossed the state border a while back without much ceremony. Nebraska into South Dakota doesn't offer a whole lot in the way of interesting road trip stories. We'd passed through Pine Ridge, and were back on a strip of highway with little to nothing to look at. It was all just fields and sky, and more of the same road disappearing ahead of us. I thought about turning back. Maybe there was a shop in that last town, but everything seemed fine. It was just that hissing sound. Trish was asleep in the passenger seat. She had taken the graveyard shift earlier in the drive. I thought about waking her, but decided to let her rest. I didn't have the map out, but I knew we were heading straight north, as the crow flies, for the foreseeable future. The sun was already starting to set. 8 hours had felt like a blink. But as I looked out over all that nothing on either side of the road, I started to feel uneasy. Uneasy that we were going to break down in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, and no payphone for miles in either direction. Then the car started to cough black smoke. Well, that settled it. I pulled off onto the shoulder of the road. We were likely 30 or 40 miles from the nearest one-horse town. Trish woke to the sound of gravel and the smell of something burning. She was just as worried as I was, though we both tried our best to hide it. I popped the hood and stared into the mess inside. It was bad. A wall of smoke hit me in the face immediately. I didn't know anything about cars then. Honestly, I still don't. Trish didn't either. But even we knew this wasn't something we were going to fix on the side of the road. That meant walking. The day had been brutally hot. I knew that much because the AC never seemed to work in that car. But the sun was nearly gone now, and the air was cooling down fast. Walking in the dark seemed like our best option. We checked the map, but that only made things worse. We were stuck somewhere between two towns. What either of them could offer was anyone's guess. We didn't remember seeing a mechanic in the last one, not even a gas station. So we decided to head north. We had been walking along the road for maybe an hour when Trish pointed ahead. Lights. At first I thought it was a town, but it wasn't. It wasn't a little Shell station either. From a distance, it almost looked like a Walmart. Some kind of massive department store dropped out in the middle of the plains. The lights gave it the strange appearance of a carnival. It was all red, yellow, and blue. They were strung in long arcs across the building, glowing against the darkness. We continued walking toward it, trying to get a better look. After another couple of miles, we finally reached it. It was a gas station, but not like any gas station I had ever seen. It reminded me a little of those giant travel stops you hear about, places like Buc-ee's. There had to be over 100 gas pumps, all of them perfectly clean, standing beneath a massive concrete canopy. The storefront behind them was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows lit up with neon signs, advertising cigarettes, beer, fresh food, and ATMs. The strangest part was how empty it was. I guess it made sense. It was close to midnight, and we hadn't seen a single car on the highway during the entire walk. Still, something about that place made my skin crawl. When something is that clean, that polished, it starts to feel wrong. The station looked like an eyesore in the endless darkness around it. It didn't belong there at all. One thing that was especially strange was the lack of branding. There was no signage anywhere claiming the store's name. As far as we could tell, it didn't even have one. We tried the front door, half expecting the place to be closed despite the multiple 24-hour signs hanging in the windows. The door opened with the jingle of a bell. We stepped inside, and that's when it really began to feel like we'd wandered into the Twilight Zone. The place was laid out more like a massive grocery store than a gas station. There were aisles upon aisles of food in bright, colorful bags. At first glance, they almost looked like brands we recognized: chips, candy, and cereal. But when you looked closer, something wasn't quite right. There were no labels, no logos. Just bright bags with bright designs. The entire store gleamed with an unnatural cleanliness. The floors shined like glass. The shelves looked freshly polished. Even the air felt sterile. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, filling the silence with a faint electric buzz. Another thing that struck me was how tall the shelves were. They towered over us, much higher than anything I'd seen in a grocery store. If someone wanted something from the top shelf, they'd need a ladder to reach it. Still, strange as it was, none of that really mattered to us. We needed a payphone. We had to call a mechanic and figure out what to do about the car. So we stood there at the front of the store for a while, pacing slowly near the registers. But there was no one there. No customers, like I said, but no cashiers either. No workers. The place was completely dead. Yet it gave off the impression that it had just opened. Triangular flags were hung in wide arcs down from the ceiling, as if a celebration were about to begin. But nobody was here. Trish called out hello to nobody in particular. Her voice echoed through the large building, bouncing off the polished floors and high shelves. We listened for a moment, expecting someone to answer, but we didn't hear anything. She shrugged at me, and we began looking around for a payphone. The aisles were long. I had the strange feeling that you could get lost in a place like this. Not the sort of lost where you wander around for a few minutes before finding the exit again, but the kind where you might never find your way back out at all. That's why I decided to stay close to the entrance. I know it sounds irrational, but there was already so much about this place that didn't seem right. Its location, and how large it was, how clean it was. The whole place had an uncanny quality to it. We were about to leave the store and check around the back of the building for a payphone when the PA system suddenly cracked to life. The loud burst of feedback made both of us jump. We waited for someone to say something ordinary, something like clean up on aisle 2 or attention shoppers, Instead, there was only silence. Then I heard something that made me stiffen. It was the low sound of breathing. Almost like someone with asthma, trying to pull air into their lungs. It was slow and strained, but it seemed far away, as if whoever was making the sound was standing somewhere deep in the back of the building. Trish looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We're not idiots. We headed straight for the door. Whoever worked here was either pulling some kind of joke on us, or was a certified lunatic, and we weren't interested in finding out which. Then the lights shut off. At the same moment, we heard the doors lock. An automated jingle played through the darkness, followed by the cheerful voice of a woman over the speakers. The store is now closing. We tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. We started shouting for someone to let us out, calling into the empty store, and hoping someone would answer. But once again, no one did. We stood there for a while, tense and unsure of what to do. It had already been a day from hell, and I could feel my temper starting to slip. I was ready to go off on the first person who showed their face. Then I saw something move down the dark aisle in front of me. A figure passed between the shelves. It looked like someone pushing a mop. I shouted and ran after them. Trish called for me in protest, but followed close behind. When I reached the spot where the man had been, my foot slipped out from under me, and I slammed hard into the shelf beside the aisle. When I looked down at the floor, I saw what I had slipped on. There was something there that smelled sour. It looked like curdled milk. A trail of it stretched across the otherwise flawless floor, leading in the direction the janitor or store employee had been moving. Whoever it was had been leaving a mess behind him as he went. Trish asked if I was okay, but I hurried her along. We needed to find the man. We followed the foul-smelling skid marks around the bend and into the next aisle. The trail didn't disappear, but it began to thin out, fading slowly as if the source of it had begun to run dry. Then the fear I had felt earlier stopped being irrational. We were standing in the middle of an intersection of aisles. They stretched away in every direction, farther than we could see. It didn't make any logical sense. We couldn't have ran that far. It was as if the store had grown around us. I noticed a row of freezers filled with frozen food. A pale fog was spilling out of them and drifting slowly along the floor of the aisle. At first, it seemed like nothing more than freezer mist, but it was spreading farther than it should have, growing thicker the longer we stood there. Soon, it became difficult to see. Trish finally said what we both were thinking. There's something wrong with this place. I don't know if paranormal is the right word for it, but we both had the same feeling. We had somehow ended up in a place that didn't belong to our world. The proportions were wrong. Even the air felt wrong, thick and sterile, in a way that made it hard to breathe normally. It almost felt like we were hallucinating. We tried to find our way back to the entrance, but the farther we walked, the more lost we seemed to become in the labyrinth of aisles. It didn't seem possible. None of it felt like it could truly be real. Our feet were already sore beyond belief from the miles we had walked from the car. It had been a miserable day that somehow kept finding ways to get worse. We passed shelves filled with bags of what I could only assume were chips. The bags were swollen with air, stretched tight like balloons that might burst if they were handled too roughly. Trish thought we should eat something. What are they going to do? She said. Something about the idea felt wrong to me. Like whatever this place was, the food here was not real, not something that could truly be consumed. By then, the freezer mist had spread all around us, gathering thick at our ankles. We were nowhere near the frozen food section anymore, but the fog had taken over the entire store. It clung to the floor like a low, pale cloud. We couldn't even see our own shoes. Trish had picked up one of the bags and was turning it over in her hands. looking for anything printed on it. There was nothing. Just a bright red bag, covered in yellow swirls, bloated and shining under the blue fluorescent light. Then she screamed and dropped it. The bag struck the floor with a sharp popping sound, and she screamed again. I ran over to her and asked what happened. There was something moving inside it, she said. At first, I thought she was losing it, the same way I probably was. But then I saw the fog shift along the floor. It moved in quick ripples, as if something beneath it was slithering away down the aisle. Neither of us said anything. We simply stood there for a moment, trying to understand what we had just seen. Trish began to cry quietly. She wanted to leave. So did I. So we started walking in the opposite direction of whatever that thing was. We were no longer interested in finding a store attendant. We just wanted to get out. We moved slowly down the aisle, hoping we could somehow stumble across an exit. At some point, the overhead speaker crackled to life again. We both froze, waiting for something terrible to come through the system, something like a blood-curdling scream. Instead, it was just the breathing again. It somehow sounded closer than it had before. We began to pick up the pace, heading in no clear direction. It may have just been my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt like the aisles were getting tighter. The shelves seemed to be closing in on us. They still stretched endlessly ahead, but the space between them felt narrower now, and it made my chest tighten with claustrophobia. I don't know exactly when it started, but Trish and I had begun running, faster and faster. We were looking for an end to the aisles, for anything that resembled a way out. That was when I looked behind me. The janitor, the man with the mop, whatever he was. He stood far down the aisle, his silhouette outlined by the glow of freezer lights and the thick fog pooling behind him. For a moment, I almost slowed down, thinking I might call out to him. Then I looked at the floor. From his direction, dozens of thin grooves were slicing through the fog behind us. Whatever they were moving, fast. I shouted for Trish to run. She screamed, though she hadn't looked back and didn't know exactly what she was running from. Ahead of us, through the fog, we saw the end of the aisle, the cash registers, the checkout area. We ran as fast as we could until we reached the automatic doors. I was fully prepared to throw my weight into them, to smash through the glass if I had to. But just before I hit them, the doors slid open. Trish and I tumbled onto the pavement outside. The doors closed quickly behind us. None of the fog, or those things, escaped the store. The gas pump sat idle beneath the canopy. The neon signs still buzzed faintly in the windows. The building was dark again, silent, as if nothing had ever happened inside. We didn't say a word. We simply started walking back toward the car. It was approaching first light when a pickup truck finally stopped for us on the side of the road. We were 50 miles from the nearest town. It was probably 10 years ago when it happened. Nobody believes me. I don't blame them. So I guess I'll just write it down and maybe, hopefully, one day someone will read this and give me the benefit of the doubt. I used to be a photographer, technically a wedding photographer, but I always had higher aspirations. Some weeks, when I didn't have work, I'd drive around looking for interesting scenes to photograph. I didn't want to take yet another photo of a national park or a famous landmark. I wanted to find something that would stand out, something that might rattle a few cages. Maybe there would be some deeper meaning in it, but that was for viewers or art critics to interpret. Up until then, I hadn't found much, just occasional oddities. A gift shop with an old doll in the window missing one eye. A horse with a permanently shocked expression on its face. A a stray dog wandering beneath a solar eclipse. None of those things really meant anything. They were just moments I happened to stumble across, but I found them interesting all the same. Anyway, like I was saying, it wasn't until around 10 years ago that I finally stumbled upon something different. I was driving through Utah. I had just finished taking a handful of depressing but emotionally evocative photos on some Indian reservation land when I came across something in the desert. The highway was empty, just a road sign wobbling slightly in the wind. I pulled over. I remember thinking to myself, now this is an art exhibit. There were probably a dozen doors standing upright across the sun-cracked ground. None of the doors were connected to anything. There were no walls or buildings. It was just random doors, standing upright in the desert. They stood alone, spaced out across the cracked earth, in a pattern that didn't seem deliberate at all. It wasn't a straight line or a circle, just a scattering of maybe a dozen doors, as if someone had walked through the desert planting them at random. Each one stood perfectly vertical. From the road, they looked almost like gravestones, but as I got closer, I realized what they were. Some were tall and some narrow. Each one was completely different from the next. They stood there in their varying colors and designs like portals to other worlds. I started taking photos immediately. Though part of me knew my photographs wouldn't really mean anything if this was just some art installation that had already been widely documented. Still, I wanted my own photos, even as personal mementos of the strange display. All of the doors looked old and weathered with age, but each had its own character. One looked industrial, made out of metal. Another was painted pink with floral designs, almost like it belonged in a dollhouse. Another was green and flat-paneled. One had a heavy golden knocker mounted to the front. I approached them slowly, snapping photos all the while. Every so often I would turn around, expecting to see other tourists or road trippers stopping to take pictures, but nobody was there. The road was still empty. It was all very strange. A light breeze drifted through the air, but the doors didn't move at all. They were secured to the ground somehow, planted firmly in the desert soil. Curiosity got the better of me, and there didn't appear to be any signage or rules to the exhibit. I assumed it was interactive. I went over to one of the doors and placed my hand on the handle. It was locked. I tried another one. Same thing. Weird. I ended up trying a handful of them before I heard the familiar click of one that was willing to open. The handle turned easily and the door swung outward. On the other side was nothing. Just the desert. Maybe that was the point, some kind of metaphor. Then I stepped through the doorway, immersing myself in the weirdness of it all. The desert looked exactly the same on the other side. Same cracked earth, same empty sky. Though, for a moment I felt something strange. The same feeling you get stepping off a roller coaster, like my equilibrium was all thrown off. I looked around. The doors were all still there. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but the wind had picked up. And something even stranger. The doors that had been locked before were now swinging gently in the breeze, slowly opening and closing, one after another, as if they had all unlocked at once, or as if they were inviting me to step through. I nearly walked through another one before I noticed something that made my heart lurch. My car wasn't there anymore. The road was gone too, the sign with it. I turned, assuming I had simply lost my bearings. But the more I looked around, the more uncertain I became of where I was standing at all, and the more the realization set in that something had happened. Panic began settling in. The wind picked up quickly and suddenly, as if matching the energy of my distress. I tried stepping back through the door I had come from. Nothing changed. The road was still gone. My car too. All around me was just the same desert, stretching in every direction, flat and endless beneath the sun. It was a one-way door. That realization settled in slowly, like a cold weight. I stood there staring through the doorway, the one I had just stepped through, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Deep down, I knew it couldn't be real. None of it could. It was insane. I shut my eyes and forced myself to breathe slowly, counting backwards in my head. It's a little trick I taught myself years ago, when panic starts creeping in. A way to ground myself when my mind starts running away from me. 10, 9, 8. But well before I reached 1, I heard something. A high-pitched laughter. The small, careless sound a child makes while hiding during a game. The sound cut clean through the wind. I remember I hoped I was back. I could see it in my mind's eye. A minivan pulling up on the highway, parked behind my car. A traveling family coming over to look at the strange attraction on the side of the road. But the sound was off. It was close, and echoed as if it were far away. Every instinct inside me told me to keep my eyes closed, to just keep breathing, and pretend none of this was happening. But of course, I looked anyway. It was a girl. Her head was sticking out from the pink door, the ones painted with the little floral patterns, the dollhouse. At first glance, she looked completely normal, just a child peeking around the edge of a door, curious about the stranger standing in the desert. But her body disappeared behind the doorframe. Then I noticed her teeth. They were thin and pointed. Not quite fangs, more like needles. And her eyes. Her eyes were completely black, just empty, staring straight at me. I think I screamed. I stumbled backward without thinking and slammed hard into the doorframe behind me, the door I had stepped through earlier. My hands fumbled desperately for the handle until I found it. I yanked it open and stepped through without even looking. The child was gone. But my car wasn't there either. There was no logic to any of this anymore. I spun around and slammed the door shut behind me, gripping the handle again with both hands. I remember mumbling to myself under my breath. Maybe a prayer. It came out more like panicked begging. I opened the door again and stepped through, this time with my eyes squeezed tightly shut. For a second, I just stood there, too afraid to look. Then I cracked one eye open. There was my car, parked on the shoulder of the road, exactly where I'd left it. The doors stood out in the desert the way they had before, quiet and still, but to my relief, all of them were now closed. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding, though the world still felt slightly off. My arms and neck were tingling. My head felt heavy, like I just had a sudden change in elevation. My understanding of reality had been shattered in just a few minutes. Either that, or I just had my first manic episode, my first bat with a lifetime of schizophrenia. I walked slowly back to the car. For a moment I panicked when I couldn't find my keys, convinced I had left them behind in that other place, but they were simply in my back pocket. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, staring out at those doors and listening carefully for that laugh. Part of me wanted to go back, to check each one, to make sure they were locked, because I still don't truly understand what was on the other side.